Here this morning, we're studying in 1 Corinthians, and Bill left off or finished the 19th verse last week, so we're going to start with the 20th verse today, and we'll finish chapter 3 and get into chapter 4. As you remember, Paul was having a discussion with the people there in Corinth about who they were following and who they needed to follow and what their focus needed to be. You know, as I was studying this, thought kept going through my mind. These people are compound complex. They don't know, and they don't know they don't know. And that's pretty much the kind of what's going on here. And I don't doubt their sincerity, but they were wrong in what they were doing. And there's, one of the big lessons I think we need to take out of all this that we're studying right now is that it doesn't matter how sincere you are if you're wrong. And there's a lot of people out there that are very sincere about what they believe, but they just believe the wrong thing. And that can be just as destructive as somebody who just, is a terrible person. They're going to end up in the same situation. So, that's kind of the theme that we're talking about as we go through here. So before we go any further, I'd like for Jeff Davis, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Almighty Father in heaven, we humbly bow before you. Thank you so much, Father, for this wonderful day you've given us to come here and heard your word. We ask, Father, that you further day this morning, and that you may divide your word properly, that you may apply it to our lives, and be more faithful service unto you. We ask, Father, that you be with all the teachers here this morning. We ask these things humbly in your Christ, your Son, Christ Jesus' name.
All right, so let's look at verses 20 and 21. And again, the Lord knoweth the thoughts of the wise, that they are vain. Therefore, let no man glory in men, for all things are yours. So these people were falsely glorying in men. They were glorying in the apostles, and they were picking out apostles and teachers that they wanted to follow, and kind of to the disregard of the rest of them. And the point that Paul's making here is, don't glory in these men and don't follow the works, because what they're doing is of man, and it's fallible. So what they need to do is they need to worry about the things of God. To glory in men and to boast about them and trust them and honor them can lead people to destruction. And the men are said, as Christians, what our glory needs to be is in the cross and the confidence that we have and that we're doing the right thing, and that Jesus is the source of the blessedness, and God is the source of the blessedness that we're going to have. And these Corinthians, they were glorying in men. Some of them were glorying in Paul, some of them were glorying in Apollos, some of them in Cephas. They were glorying. Their focus was in the wrong place. They were looking at the messenger, and they weren't looking at the message. So Paul tells them here in verse 21 that all these things of the gospel and all these things that God is giving them is theirs if they believe in what God says. And God's truth is infallible. It's eternal, and it's never going to fail. Where the words of man, some of it may be right, some of it may be wrong. Now, all of these ministers that are mentioned here, they were there doing God's will, and they were doing God's work. And really, the Corinthians there, they were losing out on all of the wisdom and things that were being given there, because they were focusing in on one person. And everybody, when they teach something, teaches in a little different style and has a little bit different emphasis on certain things. And that's why it's good to like when we have meetings here, we bring in another preacher, and get his idea and his way of teaching. And you can have three teachers teach the exact same thing. Every one of them has a little bit different emphasis, and as a result of that, they you get a different point of view, and things that you've studied forever and ever and ever might become clear because of the way that person presents it. And it's a situation where the people there in Corinth were having problems there. Any comments about those verses? All right, let's look at verse 22. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death or the things present or the things to come are all yours. So what Paul is doing here, he's making a special application to the truth that himself and the others are putting out there. And he's showing them that all of them were sent from God. All of them were children of God, and they should receive the things that each one of them are saying and apply it to their life, because all of them are faithful preachers. And if they follow the things that's being taught, then they're going to be well-rounded in the things that they're going to need to be a good Christian. So he's talking about the truth here and how applicable the truth is going to be. There's uninspired teachers that are liable to be one-sided or imperfect, rather than people who were inspired. And you got to remember, back in that time, they didn't have the Bible that they could reference. They had the Old Testament, but men like Paul and Apollos, the ones that received the spiritual gifts, they were inspired of God. And God was leading them in what they were saying. They weren't just making this stuff up as it goes along. Where the uninspired preachers were basically interpreting some of the things that they had heard, and then they were going out and expounding it. Apollos kind of got off on the wrong foot when he started his ministry. He was teaching the wrong thing, and he kind of had to be put back onto the path. And often, what of God's teaching is presented by one teacher is not preached by another, and they weren't being able to benefit from all the things, like I said before, that the people were doing. So all should be watchful to learn and do the will of God, and pay attention to what the different speakers are saying when we have a meeting, someone gets up and preach. See if they're saying what's the truth is. And like I say, you can learn a lot from the different styles of preaching. And some people relate better to different styles, but every one of the gospel preachers, if they're preaching the truth, has a message that we can apply to our life. So Paul is telling them here what a vast bit of information they're getting. It applies to the things of the world, the material things and the spiritual things. And we have to kind of keep in mind that all material things are not bad. There are things in this world that are material that there's nothing wrong with, and they're there for our enjoyment and pleasure and to be serviceable to us. But then there are also things out there in the material world that are bad for us. And but in the spiritual world, if we're following the truth of God, then everything that is being said is for our benefit. We should be able to apply it to our lives and be better Christians in the sight of God. Where somebody who is evil and has an audience, they can go and preach a bunch of stuff, and people follow them blindly, and that person is going to lead them right to destruction. And Paul's talking about here about maintaining order and maintaining the order so that there's spiritual welfare in their life. And you think about it, our life is probably one of the most precious things that we have. We only get one of them. And how we live our life is going to determine the gift and what our reward is going to be when we pass from this life. And it's our life is a great field that we have that we can sow seeds that are going to last that's going to last eternally. And when we become Christians, basically, we have a new life. We have a field to sow it in. And one of the things that, that we need to do is we need to not only promote the church, but we need to help our neighbors. And that's part of the, part of the deal here that, Paul is talking about. Of course, then he talks about death, and nobody wants to think about death. But the thing about it is, we're all going to face death at a certain time. So we see, all the way from life to death, and what's in between is, what Paul is talking about here, and how important it is to, for them to have their focus there in Corinthians on the proper thing. And it's all right there for them if they take advantage of it. He keeps using this term, all are yours. All of these blessings and all of these truths are there and being presented in a comprehensive manner, and they're not taking advantage of it because they're focused in on just one person, and what that person is saying is, instead of making God the focus and searching out the things that God would want them to do. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 23. And ye are Christ, and Christ is God. So, in the beginning, Christ was with God, and he is God. John talks about, the Word and the Word being with God, and the Word was God. So basically, by following Jesus, Jesus is the child of God. And if we are a child of God and we're following Jesus, then the same blessings that are going to be out there for us to have. And there's one God, there's one Lord, and there's one church, and this is an unbroken chain. And one of the things that we need to keep in mind, and there was strife there in Corinth because of all these problems. God doesn't want strife in the church. He wants the church to be peaceful. He wants to be unified, and he wants the church to have one message. And the way that they were conducting themselves there in Corinthians, this wasn't happening, because it appears that every time they got together and got into these discussions, instead of worrying about what God said, they were worried about what so-and-so said. And it caused strife and division in the church. Comments about those verses? Okay, let's move on then to chapter 4. It's kind of interesting to read some of the things that the scholars say about the beginning here in chapter 4, because really, chapter 4 is a continuation of the subject that we talked about in chapter 3. And a lot of the scholars kind of have a problem with how this was divided into chapters. They feel like that the 4th chapter should actually begin with verse 6, where there's a change in the subject, and going through verse 5 should actually been back in chapter 3. And it's kind of interesting to see how they see the discussions that they made on that. So let's look at verse 1. It said, "Let a man so account of us as of ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God." So Paul returns to the question, in what esteem the inspired teachers of the gospel should be held. How should the people of the congregation there at Corinth, how should they look upon the inspired teachers, the apostles, the ones that were sent to Corinth to instruct them? Like Bill mentioned last week, Paul sent Timothy over there to try to straighten that mess out, and it didn't apparently do a whole lot of good. So how does the ministers, the apostles, the teachers, how do they want to be? How do they want to be esteemed? How they want to be esteemed is of servants and under workers of Christ. In other words, as though that they were working for Christ and they're the employee and Christ is the employer, and that they're committed to these things, and they don't want themselves to get in the way of the message. They don't become the focus. The focus needs to be on the message and on Christ. Now, it's interesting to note that the word for minister in the original text, they used a word that meant an under rower. And what an under rower is back in that day, they didn't have diesel and nuclear powered boats. They had wind and oar powered. And basically, they had several different types of boats. Like one might just have one level of rowers, but some of the larger galleys would have 2 and 3 levels of rowers. And an under rower is one of the rowers who is in the lowest benches and basically down in the bows of the boat, and probably the worst possible position that are doing the rowing, and they were called under rowers. Now, the Greek word that was used in the text meant an inferior officer or an assistant. That was the Greek term for minister. So we see here there's nothing to be esteemed about the minister. Where the esteem needs to be is of God and of the message. So by this term here, the apostle shows the Corinthians that he's not the head of the church. He's not a chief. He is a follower, an apostle of Christ, and his purpose and his appointment is to go out and do the work of God. And that's where the focus needs to be, not on him, but on the message. Now, it also mentions the word steward there. And in that day and time, the steward was a kind of like an accountant, or the master's deputy in regulating the concerns of the family. He was the one who was responsible for obtaining and providing the food for the household, seeing that it was served out at the proper time. The crops were planted at the proper time. Things were there in the proper quantities. And he was also the one who received all the cash and spent all the money. But one of the important things that the steward did was he had to keep an exact account of the money that he spent, and that he was obligated at certain times to lay the accounting before the master. So Paul is basically telling him, look, I have a job to do. I do my job. And at the end of my term or at the end of my life, I'm going to have to give an accounting to God for the things that I have done. And I mean, the apostles, took this mission that they had very serious, because it had very serious consequences, not only for them, but for the people. And when you get to the situation where you're teaching or you're preaching, it's very important that you're preaching the right thing, because if you lead people astray, not only are they going to be punished for it, but the person who's expounding those things are going to have to give an account to God for the things that they teach. Now, it also talks here about the mysteries, and this is the doctrine of God that's relative to salvation, and talking about the death of Christ on the cross. Without that death on the cross and the shedding of Christ's blood, we would have no hope of eternal salvation with God. So, it talks here about mysteries. It was a mystery to these people. They did not have the full revelation of God at this particular time, and they didn't have the advantage that we have today of having the gospel, where we can go through and we can look at all of this and study it. They didn't have this advantage of doing that. So a lot of the things that were being taught were new information that these people were receiving, and they were getting a divine treasure, and this divine treasure was entrusted in the hands of the stewards by the master, and the stewards obviously being the teachers and the apostles, and God was the one who was giving out the blessing. Just like the food was dispensed at the proper time, at the proper season, the gospel was given out in the manner that it needed to be based on the situation. Matt was talking about last week about people who are new Christians are not ready for the meat of the word; they're ready for the milk of the word. When you start out, you have to start out small and work your way up. And the apostles understood this, that, they were going to have to give this to these people in a way that they could understand, in a way that they could relate to the old scriptures, to start pulling all these things together. And then as time went on, then they could get more and more into the word, because they were in some cases they were still babes in Christ. They didn't have the advantage of having people that had been in the congregation for 30, 40, 50, 60 years and had grown up in the church, and that's all basically they knew because they'd heard it all their life. People in that situation will probably grow a little bit quicker than somebody who comes into the church brand new, and you need to kind of spoon feed them and get them moving in the right direction and build on each thing that they learn. When they get that down, then you give them something new to build them up. And that's kind of what Paul was talking about here. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 2. Moreover, it is required in stewards that a man be found faithful. So God had entrusted the inspired men with these truths that he revealed to them through the Spirit. And these truths were given to them to be taught to others for their salvation and edification. And they were entrusted with a great spiritual truth that was brought to light in Christ Jesus for the salvation of the world. And, when Christ was on this earth, he selected people that he had searched their heart, and he knew that they were trustworthy people, and they would be the right people to do the job. Now, we all know that in that original 12, Paul wasn't there. He wasn't one of those people. But if you look at the qualifications that Paul had, he was a whole lot more educated, had a lot different background than say Peter, who was a fisherman. Paul was an equivalent of a college educated person who had one of the finest educations that you could get back at that time. And God looked down, saw that's who he needed, and his moral character was good. And we were talking about sincerity. There wasn't anybody more sincere than Paul when he was persecuting the Christians. He thought truly that was the thing to do. It wasn't, though. And then once he was given the light by God, he saw that all those things he was doing before were wrong. But Paul had that sincerity. Once he focused in on what he thought was right or what was right, he didn't deviate from it. And that's a good trait to have. I remember one time, if you'll remember Justice Scalia from the Supreme Court, I heard him talk one time, and he was talking about focusing in on the Constitution. And he says he studies and he studies and he studies, and he focuses in on what the Constitution said, and that's his roadmap. And he judges whatever the case is based on what he has studied and staying focused on the Constitution. That's what we need to do as Christians. We need to study, focus in on what the message is, learn the message, and stick to it. And that's what the apostles did. And that their example is an example for us today. So we are entrusted with these same things that the apostles were entrusted with then. We got it a different way than they got it. It didn't just come down from on high on us. What we have learned, we've had to study to get the message. So we have to remember that to not teach the commandments is to leave the world in condemnation. And a steward who fails to teach these things is not a good steward. So Paul told the elders at Ephesus, in leaving them, he said, "Wherefore I testify unto you this day that I am pure from the blood of men, for I shrank not from declaring unto you the whole counsel of God." So, Paul didn't shirk from what he was saying. Now, you think about it, this probably wasn't a very popular letter that got sent to the Corinthians, because, he's wearing these people out. but he's telling them the truth. And, if it sinks down in good hearts and they realize that they're wrong and they repent and they straighten things out, then, he's done a good thing. If they reject it, then, it's on them. It's not on Paul, because he told them, what the truth was. He was an honest steward, and he was distributing God's word to others. So teachers today, are in a limited sense also stewards of God to deliver his teachings to the world. Not on the same level as the apostles were, but still on a very important level. And one who refuses to teach the whole will of God is dishonest toward God and unfaithful. And Matt's talked several times here lately about teaching the whole world, or teaching the whole gospel to the world, and not picking and choosing the things that you like and the things that you don't like. Because there's things in the Bible that touch every one of us to bring forth our shortcomings. We all have shortcomings, and the Bible illuminates those shortcomings that we have, and we need to not be so hard-hearted not to change the things. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verses 3 and 4. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged of you, or of man's judgment. Yea, I judge not mine own self. For I know nothing by myself, yet am I not hereby justified, but he that is justifieth me is the Lord. So it wasn't really a matter of concern to Paul how they were going to judge him in this situation. He didn't have to justify his faithfulness to the Corinthians. Okay? And those who preferred Apollos, or those who preferred Cephas before Paul, would of course give their reason for their preference. And it could have been a variety of reasons. It could have been a good thing, or it could have been a bad thing. Maybe they didn't like the way that Apollos looked, and they liked the way that Cephas looked. I don't know. It's not revealed to us here. But Paul is he's worried more about telling them the truth, and not worried about how he stands in esteem with the people. He's worried more about the truth. He's not responsible to them. He's responsible to God. And God was the one, and Jesus, are the ones. God was the one who sent him there, and they weren't the steward of the word. He was the steward, and he was going to be responsible in judgment for the things that that he had said. And he had no standard to judge himself, but by the will of God. He knew what the standard was, and he wasn't worried about judging himself. God was going to judge him. He wasn't worried about the other people judging him also. And he was conscious of no failure to do his duty as a minister. He had a clear conscience that he was teaching the things that he was supposed to be teaching. And if they didn't believe it, then that was on them. So obviously God might have known something against them, but in his heart, he didn't see anything that was wrong by his teaching. And comments about that verse, or those verses. Okay, let's look at verse 5. Therefore judge nothing before the time, until the Lord come, who both will bring to light the hidden things of darkness, and will make manifest the counsels of the heart. And then shall every man have praise of God. So wait for the Lord's judgment, when he will bring the light to all the things that are now hidden. And there are things even to this day that are hidden from us, and it's not revealed to us what these things are. We can speculate, and we can think, and we can wonder, but we don't know, because it's hidden. And there's truths and unsearchable truths in the Bible that we just don't understand. And when the time is right, and in the judgment, and when we're there with God, we can ask God about it. What are these things? It'll be revealed to us, sometimes in heaven. So he will then open their view of the secret motives of the heart, and then every man faithful can be a faithful steward, and they will praise God. As these things are opened up to these people, and they realize the problems that they have done, and they overcome those, and then they see all the good things that God has done for them, then they're going to praise God. And there's obviously going to have to be some turning away and going in a different direction for these people. But Paul had confidence that God would justify him and Apollos and all the things over which the Corinthians had divided and for which they had been condemned. Paul was confident in the message that he was giving, the message of God, that it could straighten the situation out if the Corinthians would open their heart and hear the message that Paul was giving them. And this does not mean that men should not test themselves by the word of God, by which God is going to judge them. That's why we study. We know what the standard is. It's a perfect standard. And we need to, from time to time, see how we measure up to that standard, and then see if we're still on the course that we need to be on. Comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 6. It says, "And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sake, that ye might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, that no one of you be puffed up for one against another." So this was said to impress upon them that in their esteem for teachers, they should not follow the teacher. They need to do what the will of God is, as it was revealed to them, and then later on as it was written. When the Gospels came about and they were put in writing, all these letters started to circulate. Don't esteem the messenger, esteem the message. So neither Paul nor Apollos had headed any of these factions. And Paul has spoken in this epistle as though they had done this, but this was kind of to spare the feelings of the real leaders of the faction, and he kind of put himself and Apollos in their places, and it was just kind of a tactful way of doing it, because sometimes people turn away when they're personally attacked, and you've got to sometimes go kind of around the bend a little bit to present it into a way that you don't turn them off at the very beginning. You find a way to open up their heart and open up their mind so that they hear what you say. And there's a difference between listening and hearing. You can hear a lot of stuff, but when you listen, you apply the things that you've heard. So basically, I have made use of my own and Apollos' name in my argument against your division, because I would spare to name those teachers among you who are guilty of making leading parties, that in us you might learn not to follow one with a party. So that's basically paraphrasing what Paul has said there. And Paul and Apollos, they didn't make these parties. The Corinthians put these parties together by themselves. And there was other ambitious men that were doing this, and they wanted to be the leaders, and they were picking the things that Apollos said that he was emphasizing, and then there was another group that was emphasizing the things that Paul said. Both of them were telling the truth, but they were just picking and choosing the things that they wanted to follow, and as a result of that, they had division in the church because they weren't following the full truth. So he had done this, that the Corinthians, seeing the evil of such thing, even in an apostle, might see it more plainly in their little local party leaders, and might not boast themselves of any one leader to the disparagement of the others, or to the disparagement of the gospel. So doubtless there were persons in Corinth who, taking advantage of the spirit of innovation among that people, set themselves as teachers and endeavored to draw disciples to them. Instead of drawing the disciples to God, they were drawing the disciples to them, and they were getting the following. That was several thousand years ago. But you know what? That same thing is going on today. You look at some of these mega churches that are out there. These leaders of these churches, or these preachers. It's all about them, and it's all about the benefit to them. And they've deceived all these people, and they've got themselves all puffed up because of the things that they've been able to do. And Paul would condemn something like that in a heartbeat. But it goes on today, probably on a lot bigger scale today than it did back then. So the point is that that the teacher and the preacher and the evangelist, the job's not to get puffed up about it. The job is to present the word and be humble about it, and stay on message, and really not worry a whole lot about what the people think. If you're doing the truth, then that's the most important thing. Comments about that verse? Where are we at, Keith? We got another couple minutes. All right, let's do one more verse here. Look at verse 7. For who maketh thee to differ from another? And what hast thou that thou didst not receive? Now if thou didst receive it, why dost thou glory? And if thou hadst not received it? So it's likely that the apostle here is addressing himself to someone of those that are those puffed up teachers, who was glorifying his gifts and his knowledge that he had of the gospel. And so Paul basically asked them some questions. Who made them the leaders of the party that arrayed one against another? There needs to be unity in the church, and all through the gospel it talks about unity. Who were these people? Who put them in charge, basically, and who put them in a position to split the church down the middle? And this glorification and depreciation of rival teachers sprang from an unwarranted arrogance. They were arrogant about these things. Kind of like I said before, don't know and don't know they don't know. They were right there, with an arrogant way to them. And it involved the claim to superiority and a right to sit in judgment, which they did not possess. They're sitting up there making all these judgments. They didn't have that right. Paul didn't have that right. And you look at the difference between the attitude that Paul had of being a humble servant, and these people who were, look who I am. I'm the one who's going to call the shots here because I have all the answers. Well, these people weren't inspired. Paul was inspired. He had the correct message. These other people were kind of making it up as they went along. And that can kind of really get you in trouble, or just take part of the gospel and turn it around. And you read part of the verse, it's just like you follow the Bible said, well, Judas hung himself, do the same. So obviously we're not supposed to go out and hang ourselves. You just take bits and pieces, and you can come up with a lot of things. So what did they have in way of gifts and knowledge that they did not receive from those to whom God gave His Spirit? These people got their knowledge from Paul and Apollos and Cephas and all of them. It didn't come from God. It came from man, but God worked through the men. They didn't have a divine revelation like Paul and the ones who had the spiritual gifts at the time. They had received it from the apostles. So God made them to differ in both natural and in spiritual gifts, and that was that was the thing about the apostles. And in Romans 12:3 it says, "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but think soberly." So that's a good place to stop right there. And we'll pick up next week with a little bit more of this verse. So I appreciate everybody's attention today.
Thank you.